Hi, my name is Gary D. Rhodes. I'm here to talk about the film White Zombie, which is one of my favorites because I'm a film historian that published a book about this very movie in 2001, and I believe that book contains the only really lengthy biography of the director of the film, Victor Halperin. I think one of the wonderful things about this version of the film we're watching is it's an amazing restoration of what we in film history would call an orphan film, a film that though released by United Artists, was an independent movie. In fact, it was really the first major independent horror film. And throughout horror film history, it's often been the independent films, the Night of the Living Deads, the Texas Chainsaw Massacres, that have actually been landmarks in the genre. So we're going to talk about this film, and I'd like to say some things that might be in my book, but I'd also like to augment my arguments about the film with some more recent thoughts I've had about the film. One of the things I want to talk about as we look at it is my argument that would be against the prevailing view, which is that this film is very old-fashioned, and more particularly that this film was quite old-fashioned and outdated even when it was released in the summer of 1932, and that's the argument I'm going to very much challenge. But what we can say for sure as we begin is that this was the first feature-length zombie movie, this subgenre of horror that has remained so popular into the 21st century, and it's certainly the key zombie film prior to Night of the Living Dead in 1968. It's actually, funnily enough, not the first zombie film. That would be a misstatement. There was a short subject released in 1931 that had a segment on Haitian zombies that was reviewed in Film Daily. It doesn't seem to exist. So it's not the first zombie film, but it's the first feature-length zombie film, and a topic that most audiences would not have known about. If we look at some of the previous horror films from Hollywood in the sound era, films like Dracula and Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde of 1931, these were topics, storylines that audiences would, in many cases at least, already have known because of the fame of the novels on which they were based and so forth, as well as the folklore of, say, vampires. Zombies, that was something that was new to audiences, generally speaking, in 1932 when this film was released. Your average American would not have known the word zombie until this film was released. And this film, this independent film, which becomes, it's difficult to know for sure, but becomes very possibly the most successful independent film of the 1930s. This film made America aware of what a zombie is. It even led to the creation of the zombie cocktail. So it had a cultural impact that is, I think, quite important. And even at the and gave us importantly the definition of what zombies are. The fact that there was no major zombie novel, unlike say a Stoker's Dracula or a Shelley's Frankenstein, leads us to wonder, well, who thought up the story? Where did all this come from? The major source text for this film, it's such a major influence on the film. In fact, I can't believe its author, William B. Seabrook, did not sue the filmmakers. The book was called The Magic Island, and it was published in 1929. Seabrook is the kind of person I think we would have enjoyed having dinner with, most of us, because he was a real raconteur. He had been born in the 1880s. He had fought in World War I, and then he seemed to go on a series of adventures, writing travelogues about the adventures in which the story seemed always much more important to him than perhaps the strictness of nonfiction. And The Magic Island was his book about Haiti, which included a fascinating chapter, profoundly important on the film we're watching, called Dead Men Walking in the Cane Fields, referring to the sugar cane fields that we see in this film. Now, despite the huge influence of Seabrook on this movie, Haiti had really had a particular place in the American imagination in 1932, in part because the U.S. military occupied the country from 1915 to 1936, and so that's something that a lot of audience members, certainly adult audience members, would have known and read about in the daily newspapers of the years prior to this film. Tony Williams the film scholar, has actually, in an old issue of Jump Cut, published a very good essay talking about how the film represents a kind of a macabre version of the forced labor system that the U.S. inflicted on the Haitian population during that military period. Seabrook, though, wasn't the first to talk about this, nor were newspapers with regard to the American involvement in Haiti. Throughout the 19th century, there were a number of books published and available in America about Haiti that, while they did not talk about zombies, they very definitely talked about the voodooism present in Haiti. They very definitely talked about the cannibalism, in some claims at least, the superstitions of Haiti. For example, W. Harvey's book, Sketches of Haiti, in 1827, or even the much more well-distributed book by Spencer St. John in 1884, Haiti or the Black Republic, as it was titled. When in that very book, St. John asked the question, who is tainted by voodoo worship in Haiti? He answered his own question by saying, who is not? What I'm getting at is that throughout the 19th century, in so many American publications and magazines, we get descriptions of Haiti as an exotic place, a superstitious place. And by 1889, we get in an American publication, the Century magazine, the first appearance in America that I've been able to find, at least, of the word zombie in print. The word zombie in print, actually, I did find one reference as early as 1792, but in terms of American publications, that first occasion was 1889. So you've got this big history leading up to William Seabrook and his 1929 book, The Magic Island. Now, that book, The Magic Island, I would say, despite the fact there's so many prior texts, I would repeat that it is the main influence on this film, and that chapter about dead men walking in the cane fields very much informs parts of the movie we're watching. Seabrook, for example, talks about bodies being buried on roads in which people commonly pass so that their bodies would be safe from exhumation. This is what we see at the beginning of White Zombie, for example, in that opening scene where Madge Bellamy, the lead actress, talks to us about what are they doing there in the road. Another aspect of the film that draws upon Seabrook is the mention of vultures and depictions of vultures, because in this film the lead villain, played by Bela Lugosi, a character known inside the film as Murder, his character name. In promotional materials, he was known as Murder Legendre, but in the surviving prints, the word Legendre is never actually heard. At any rate, the Lugosi character, his costume clearly draws on drawings that are in Seabrook's book, The Magic Island. The vulture that is Murder's talisman, we see that in The Magic Island. There's even images we'll see in White Zombie of some of the zombies swaying on the hillside in silhouette. Very memorable images as part of the film's, I think, very beautiful and haunting to me cinematography and mise-en-scène. Those stem from drawings inside Seabrook's book. Perhaps most notably of all, though, to put an end to this part of the discussion, Seabrook talks at length about Article 249 of the Haitian Penal Code, which spoke about the problems of people being exhumed and so forth. It was a kind of a legal allusion to zombieism in Haitian law, and that is very much discussed within, as we'll hear in this film, White Zombie, including the mention of the actual penal code itself. So Seabrook is one of the key, if not the key influence, I would argue, on this film, since the filmmakers did not have a novel like a Dracula or a Frankenstein on which to rely. Now, I would have to say, of course, The Magic Island was not a bestseller, but it was published by a major publisher. Many persons would have read it. Many persons in America would have read about it in reviews, but it wasn't a bestseller. And yet we can also say that book influenced something that occurred between 1929 and its publication and 1932, the year of White Zombie, the film we're watching. And that is a play, a Broadway play that opened in February 1932 called simply Zombie. which was written by Kenneth Webb, and it starred Pauline Stark, who had been and was a notable silent film actress. Now, the story was about an American in Haiti and about zombies and plantations, and that's not entirely unlike what we're seeing in this film with regard to characters like Beaumont, who's even on the screen in the middle right now, played by the actor Robert Fraser, with his boots on there. And so there's a little bit of the story of White Zombie that seems to maybe possibly stem from this Broadway play, which was itself a complete flop. It closed after only 20 performances on Broadway, and then it reopened in Chicago briefly. I will say, though, to conclude talking about that play, even though it was a flop, it seemed to borrow from William B. Seabrook's The Magic Island, and White Zombie seemed to borrow from the play and William B. Seabrook. The author of the play, the producers of the play, actually did try to bring litigation against the makers of our film, the one we're watching now, because of copyright infringement. So while the man who probably deserved the most credit, William B. Seabrook, did not, the authors of this failed play did try to stake their own claim on, among other things, this word, zombie. And as if it could be, although no one technically tried to trademark it, as if it was a brand or a trademark name that somebody could control or own, which was not proven to be true. Now, since we've talked so far about the kinds of texts and ideas that informed the film, I'd now like to switch and talk about the people who actually made it, because I have to say, though, as a personal aside, this has always been one of my favorite films. It's always been one of my favorite horror films. And as much as I've written about the actor Bela Lugosi, the men who made the film are quite fascinating in and of themselves. And that would be a team, two brothers. They are not. I don't think it's an entirely apt comparison, but I sometimes think of them as the 1930s version of the Coen brothers. We had Victor Halperin, the director, Victor Hugo Halperin, his full name, and we had his brother Edward, who acted as producer. They made their first film in 1922 and continued thereafter to be in the film business for many years. Now, Victor Halperin, who directed the film, including scenes like the one that's starting to unfold now, which I think is one of the great scenes in the film and one of the great scenes in the 1930s horror cinema, Victor that is, had been born in Chicago in 1895, and he had appeared in vaudeville as a child, so he had a long history in the entertainment business. He was a trained musician, and he attended the University of Chicago, where he was involved in the Dramatics Club. He also attended the University of Wisconsin School of Journalism and entered the military to fight in World War I, although the anecdote I learned from his second wife, who is now deceased, Vanita, the anecdote is the day he was assigned to go overseas was Armistice Day, the very day the war ended. But that was Victor Halperin. Now, from there, Victor and his brother Edward went into business together. They went into the advertising business, and they went into the advertising business when they moved to Los Angeles. And it was there that Victor, not surprisingly, got into the movie business, first writing some westerns for a little company called Cactus Features. And he eventually was able, with his brother, to take over Cactus Features, and he renamed it Halperin Productions after themselves. Their first released film, which, as I already said, came in 1922, was called Danger Point. But their big breakthrough came the following year with a film. I thought it was an interesting title. It was called T, with a kick and an exclamation point at the end of it. I think there should probably be more films that have exclamation points in their titles, because it has such a verve to it. You know, when you say Oklahoma or when you say Oliver, it had that exclamation point, this strange title, this film, which starred some rather notable persons for that period: Crichton Hale, Zazu Pitts, and Chester Conklin. This film became a big success and allowed them to continue building on that success throughout the 20s, making a number of other films that decade as a director and producer team. Now, the idea a lot of people had in Hollywood with the coming of sound, which was, of course, we associate with 1927 and the Jazz Singer, but was actually a several-year process as not only the producers, the studios made the transition to sound, but the exhibitors did as well, installing the equipment to play back sound films. With Hollywood, there were many people in Hollywood that thought that sound, the coming of sound, would be the death of many an independent producer. Or director like Victor, because of the cost of the technology and the changes that were underway. But that proved to be untrue overall as a prediction. And it certainly proved to be untrue with the Halperin brothers, because in 1929 they produced She Goes to War, which was a talkie, and it was successful. And then at the beginning of 1930, there was their film Party Girl, which starred Douglas Fairbanks Jr., the son of obviously the famous silent film actor. So they were not at all slowed by the transition to sound. In fact, I think films like Party Girl show how well they adapted to sound and its possibility with regard to sound effects and their effective usage, which I believe in our sugar mill scene we've already watched. I mean, we hear these tremendous sound effects in this film, but we also, I think in a film like Party Girl, they really showed their ability to integrate music interestingly into sound film productions. Now, when it comes to White Zombie, the earliest that I have been able to find after spending probably too many years with this film as a traveling companion, the earliest I've found mention of this film being a possibility, being announced, was January 6, 1932, and it's quite clear to me that the film was building on the nascent horror cycle, which was the term that the industry used at the time as opposed to genre. The nascent horror cycle that though we might quibble about its beginning, certainly the industry at that moment believed began with Dracula in February of 1931 and continued with films in 1931 such as Svengali, such as Murder by the Clock, such as Frankenstein, and such as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, which premieres at the very end of 1931. And the success of these films, perhaps not so much Jekyll and Hyde, because the announcement I'm talking about came literally only a few days after people began to watch Jekyll and Hyde, but the success of these nascent horror film genre of the sound period, this obviously led the Halperins to White Zombie, to the topic of zombies, seeing, in other words, the possibility financially, being quite canny businessmen, I believe, the possibilities financially of making a horror movie, which is something that they hitherto had not done. Now, Victor Halperin later recalled that the voodoo practices of Haiti had long fascinated him, long before the making of this film, and that he concocted the idea of the story with Garnet Weston, the man who is credited as screenwriter. Now, whether that's all entirely true or not, I guess we can merely speculate, but certainly Weston was the screenwriter. Garnet Weston was a Canadian. He was born in Toronto in 1890, and he was a published poet by the 1910s. By the 20s, he had made his way to Hollywood and had begun to work in the publicity department at Paramount Studios. But prior to White Zombie, he had only one produced screenplay to his name. It was a 1931 film called The Viking. Now, in terms of producers, I've already talked about Edward Halperin and of course his relationship with his brother, which is, I think, crucial. But another producer, a very notable independent producer of the 1920s, became involved with White Zombie. His name was Phil Goldstone, and like the Halperins, probably saw the possibilities in this growing horror genre. And he was responsible for hiring Madge Bellamy, the actress in our film, the lead actress, whom I've always personally believed has been quite treated unfairly by modern critics who criticize her acting for being somewhat out of date. But one of the criticisms I might make as a rejoinder is that so many of the people, I believe, who write about the early 1930s horror films so often watch them in isolation. And what I mean by that is that they may have watched ad infinitum the early 30s horror films, but don't always watch dozens, even hundreds of films from the early talkie period to perhaps have a more broad view of films themselves at the period. And here I'm talking to return to Madge, and there she is with her wedding gown. I believe that, in other words, some writers, and I don't want to cast too many stones at others, but they don't watch enough films of the period to know that acting styles themselves were undergoing, as cinema itself was, an evolution with a sound transition that truly was a transition, a multi-year transition. And so I believe Madge has, with all due respect to some prior writers, Madge has probably been a little unfairly treated as far as her acting in this film, I believe personally. At any rate, the producer Phil Goldstone I mentioned earlier was responsible for hiring Madge Bellamy, and she had really hardly worked from 1930 to 32. This was happening. It's not unique to Madge, so again, we needn't beat up on her. It was happening to so many actors and actresses as they did or did not decide to make the transition to talkies. They were or were not able to for a variety of reasons. At any rate, Goldstone paid Madge Bellamy $5,000 to appear in White Zombie. Regrettably, she later said very little about the film, even though she was asked about it a great deal, including by myself, and she herself later wrote an autobiography. On one occasion, in bizarre fashion, to my way of thinking, she claimed that she lost her voice on the second day of filming this movie, White Zombie, and that her entire voice had to be dubbed as a result, somebody else's voice. I personally believe that she must have gotten confused or misremembered, because I think simply watching the film closely suggests that the voice we're hearing is hers by comparison to her other talkies, as well as just watching the synchronicity of the mouth moving with the voice. So she got paid $5,000. What does that mean in terms of the whole budget? Well, there's some arguments about the budget because there was various litigation about this film in the years that followed, and so it's hard to tell exactly how much this independent film cost to make. And of course, that's true in so many cases of all movies, including of that period where some things do or do not get counted against a film's budget. But it would seem that this film, based upon all the kinds of documentation I can find, this film cost somewhere between $50,000 and about $62,500. So Madge made a good bit of that. Now, when we come to our man on the screen, somebody who I guess, if I can say, and I don't know that this is anything to brag about, but that I've probably written about more than any other human being with several books on Bela Lugosi, the question becomes his salary, right? Because he had become a notable name. He had become, I think we can fairly say, during the course of 1931, a star in the Hollywood sense of the word, because of Dracula, which had been released in February 1931. So how much did he make? Well, this is a real point of contention because no contract survives. So don't let any author tell you otherwise. We do not know and cannot know for sure how much he made unless some new documentation appears that none of us who have written about this film know of. The estimates that occur are everything from $500 to $5,000. Now, what can we say about that, just in terms of speculation? My dear friend Richard Sheffield, who has since passed away, was a close friend of Bela Lugosi's. We actually co-wrote a book about him together, and Dick told me with absolute certainty that he had seen a contract in Lugosi's apartment in the 1950s amongst some papers, IRS papers and tax papers and everything, and that stated $5,000, which would be, in fact, the same Madge Bellamy was paid, and Lugosi being arguably the bigger star of the two in 1932. Why might we think he was paid less? Well, Lugosi was in financial trouble in 1932. He actually went bankrupt that year. He was always maybe spending a little too much money. So this is the argument that perhaps he accepted a lower amount because he was in need of money, and this was a quick film shoot, and it was an independent shoot, and he stupidly took the job just for some quick cash. All of that could be true. Frankly, all of it might not be true. One of my favorite sayings is when one person says the question, is that a true story? The response is, well, it's true, it is a story. And I think that's something fair to mention at this moment because we simply don't know how much he was paid. If somebody asked me, I would speculate, and that's all I can do, I would speculate that he was closer to that $5,000 number that Dick believed he saw in that paperwork. Not only because Dick saw he said the paperwork, but it seems hard to believe for me that as much of a star as he was, whatever his own personal financial troubles at the time, that Lugosi would have been paid only 1/10 of what Madge Bellamy was paid. But at any rate, that's my own view. When it comes to some of the other people in the film, I think they're actually quite fascinating as well. Other people meaning the other actors. For example, Joseph Cawthorn plays the interesting role in this film, and it's an interesting dual role. I think that's unique among the early horror film of both the wise elder, meaning he's the man that reads from the Haitian Penal Code. He's the man that is the wizened person who is not Haitian himself, his character, but knows about Haiti, knows where to go to find out information. He knows how best to help the young male lead who is somewhat impotent to the problems around him. This is not unlike the wise elder, say, Van Helsing in Dracula to the Jonathan Harker in the prior year's version of Dracula with Bela Lugosi. So on the one hand, Cawthorn plays that part. On the other hand, he plays the film's comic relief. As we'll see, even the final words of the film, him asking for a match so he can smoke some tobacco, and the interesting thing there is we have the wise elder simultaneously being the film's comic relief. It's not unusual for a horror film of this period to have comic relief, of course. We see that in say maybe Dracula with the character Martin, played by Charles Gerard. We see that with maybe Baron Frankenstein in the film Frankenstein. Or even in silent films, Crichton Hale, I think of Shivering Under the Bed in 1927's The Cat and the Canary. So it's not unusual to have comic relief, and it's not unusual, I think, in this period for the belief to be that some comic relief was needed to offset the very purpose of this genre, as its name suggests, to scare people, to horrify people, and thus the comic relief to relieve their tension. So Joseph Cawthorn, who was probably best known as a comedian, he, for example, had been in the film Picho Reno, the comedy in 1931. He was even allegedly President Woodrow Wilson's favorite comedian. He plays this interesting role both as comic relief and as wise elder, so I think that's somewhat unique. Now, when it comes to some of our other actors, we have our friend who's on screen now in one of my favorite scenes in the film, where he's drunken and disturbed. He's in isolation, even though he's in a crowd, so to speak. The other people in this tavern, this bar, this pub, seen only in silhouette, and he, of course, pining for his lost love. Madge Bellamy's character, who has now, as we've seen so wonderfully in a point of view shot, been placed into her vault. Our friend here is John Herron. He started his career with a bit part in D.W. Griffith's film Hearts of the World in 1920. Frankly, John Herron was probably best known for being the brother of Bobby Herron, who actually died tragically the same year that John's film career began. But here he is playing what I've essentially already described, the kind of the Jonathan Harker character, the kind of the young male lead who is disunited from his love by the film's villain, or villains in this case, we could argue, that their love is interrupted and has to become a key part of the plot line to be reunited. Here we might say that the film's not entirely unlike Dracula, for example, where Mina and Harker become somewhat separated due to the interloping of the vampire. Now, when I said the word villains earlier, we could say that we're talking about two of our gentlemen on screen now. Bela Lugosi, of course, in the plantation hat, the very one that mimics artwork in Seabrook's book, The Magic Island. We've got this wonderful, I think now, collection of zombies that are being introduced. And I think we, as quick as the film was shot and as low budget as it was, the kinds of things some writers have complained about, I think we can see this wonderful notion, an idea that each of these zombies has its own little backstory as well as very, very different makeup. Now, the gentleman that he's talking to on screen at the moment, Lugosi that is an actor, the other villain, we might argue, of the story, the man who so wants to possess the flower. I think we can rightly call her a Madge Bellamy flower when I say that, because flower is the means by which the zombie powder translates her, makes her become a zombie. The gentleman he's talking to in the film, Beaumont, is played by Robert Fraser, who had long been a Broadway actor. He had also appeared in such films as the 1912 version of Robin Hood and the 1913 version of Rob Roy. So he had this long career, and during the teens and 20s, he mainly played supporting characters as he continued to do after White Zombie. In fact, Lugosi aficionados, whom I assume probably make up the largest number of people buying this Blu-ray restoration, will likely remember Robert Fraser appearing with Lugosi again 10 years later in a film called Black Dragons. Other actors, the one other one I'd like to draw attention to is an actor who I think is a tremendous actor, who has a small but I would argue pivotal role in this film, and that is Clarence Muse, the African-American actor who plays the carriage driver at the beginning of the film. Why do I say he's so pivotal to the film? Well, if we go back to everything I was jabbering about with regard to the word zombie, let's recall that, while the country of Haiti was prominent in the American press for so many years, while there had been so many books about Haitian superstitions, when it comes to that specific word zombie, many audiences in the summer of 1932 simply wouldn't have known the word. There had been the word in Seabrook's book, but many people would not have known the actual word zombie or a definition of it. Now, this is quite different from, say, Dracula, which had been the novel and the stage play, and even aside from anybody who had or had not read or seen those things, the people knew what a vampire was due to the prevalence of that folklore in so many respects. But here we have the problem of what is a zombie? What is Madge Bellamy, who's now in her coffin, being carried in a shot that we're seeing at this very moment that also kind of mimics, I think, some of the artwork in Seabrook's book, The Magic Island. What is a zombie? Again, it's such a pivotal question in the summer of 1932. Everyone knows now. Few, relatively speaking, would have been able to talk in any length on the subject in 1932. And it is our friend, the actor Clarence Muse, that carriage driver, that actor who was such a great actor in so many respects, with such great dignity, I believe. It is he who explains to the audience at the beginning of this film what zombies are. And that, I believe, is so crucial. In terms of Muse, he had begun making films in 1929, but he was a multi-talented thinker and writer and well-respected, even in the early 1930s, with, among other things, the fact he had written the lyrics to the song When It's Sleepy Time Down South that became Louis Armstrong's theme song. And now I'd like to talk about a few of the people who made this film, including somebody responsible for the very images we're watching now, which is another of my favorite scenes, because we just started on actor John Herron's back, and the camera has moved backwards to now show us John Herron with Joseph Cawthorn, and this entire scene unfolds in a single shot, but with regularly, within reason, I think, for the time period, regularly mobile camera work. The cameraman on this film was Arthur Martinelli, whose career dates to at least 1918, and he had worked on films with the likes of John Barrymore and Mary Pickford. But during the second half of the 20s, for no good reason that I can seem to find, his career seems to have slowed up a bit. And it would seem to me, in my research, that White Zombie was his first credited film of the 1930s. Martinelli seems, in the various oral histories, such as they are, and they're limited, that I was able to conduct or find, Martinelli seems to have been the one who figured out, in terms of the film's special effects, how to make Lugosi's eyes appear on screen filling the screen in extreme close-up, surrounded completely by darkness. And he did this by putting very small pinholes in cardboard and shining a light through it. It seems Martinelli, this tremendous camera operator, thought up that idea. It's possible Halperin did as well. But regardless, I think this film is, at its best, is capable of haunting imagery. And I think Arthur Martinelli is much to do with that. The Howard Anderson Company is also really, I think, much responsible for the film's special photographic effects, its wonderful mise-en-scène. I think these images, I saw images of this film, still photographs, for some years as a boy before I got to see the film for the first time at about the age of 12 or 13, thanks to the arrival of VHS tape. One of my favorite Christmas mornings was getting that Christmas gift to finally see the film. But even prior, the imagery in the still photographs I'd seen, so, I think, haunting, so remarkable, so memorable. One of the reasons, I think, one of the many good reasons that the Rhone Group have been so wise and helpful in restoring this film more than once. And the Howard Anderson Company, including a man who worked there named Conrad Trichler, are also responsible for some of this incredible imagery that has certainly made an impression on me through the years. Trichler was responsible for the film's glass paintings, and so when we see, for example, the exterior of Legendre's castle, or even the upper interior of it, this was something that Victor Halperin talked about in later years and remained proud of, Trichler's work in using glass paintings to expand, say, when it comes to the interior of the castle. Only part of what we're seeing, the lower section, is an actual set, the upper section being Trichler's glass paintings. The final person, I think, to mention here is the makeup artist, a name that would be well known, I think, to most of the persons watching this DVD, and that would be Jack Pierce. There was also a man named Carl Axel who helped on the makeup. But Jack Pierce was the man who, among other things, we think of when we think of Universal horror films, when we think of the makeup for the Frankenstein monster in the 1931 and subsequent versions, some of the subsequent versions, when we think of the Wolfman, when we think of even Dracula. The argument has often been that though Jack Pierce did the makeup for the film Dracula, that he did not himself work on Bela Lugosi's face. Like my good friend Michael Blake, who is the author of several books on Lon Chaney Sr., I disagree with that view, which is based merely in speculation. I think Pierce did work on Lugosi for his makeup for Dracula, which is so different than what Lugosi had applied for the stage version, as well as probably helped apply the little hairpiece that Lugosi wore in Dracula to make the more pronounced widowpeak he had in that film, Dracula. Pierce is our makeup man here. If there's one makeup artist in the classic era of horror films to talk about and to laud, it would be Jack Pierce, and he's responsible for the makeup in this film, including some of that wonderful and very distinctive from zombie to zombie, I would argue, makeup that we see in this film. And to return to my earlier point, we began on John Herron's back, and here we are ending in one extensive, but I argue somewhat mobile and wonderful shot that took us to our fade to black there, and now up to Trichler's glass painting, at least insofar as the castle exterior we're seeing. Now, from the production crew that we've talked about, the actors we've talked about, the origins of the story, at least some of them, William Seabrook and so forth, I now want to talk just a little bit about the film's production. The film was shot, it would seem, there's a couple of little discrepancies, but it would seem, here's more wonderful mobile camera that we're getting from Arthur Martinelli. The film, I think, was shot over 11 days, seems to be the best estimate, in March and April of 1932. Some of the publicity would claim that the film was shot in Haiti, but that's complete nonsense. Clarence Muse, the actor who plays the carriage driver that I was applauding earlier, later claimed that the film was shot on the backlot of United Artists, but I think, with all due respect, he was simply misremembering, because United Artists eventually became the distributor of the film, and I think he simply just made a little bit of an incorrect comment there in his memories. The assistant camera operator, Enzo Martinelli, remembered and I believe quite correctly remembered, shooting the entire film at Universal Studios, except for some exteriors. Now, my good friend, my dear friend, the late George Turner, many persons affiliated with the American Society of Cinematographers will no doubt know of his affiliation with that organization. He was, like myself, quite entranced by this film and wrote about it, I think even probably before I was born. Did some of the most important early work, I would argue the early work on this film in terms of production history, in terms of film history. We should give the credit to George Turner. I certainly would. And he, living in California, was able to find a few of the locations off of the Universal set for some of the exteriors that were used. And some of them, I think, shot at night, because one of my favorite images in the film, of the many, are when we see breath, actually icy breath, coming out of the mouth of Legendre as he's speaking. But George Turner, to get back to the main point, he realized that the veranda at the climax of the film seems to be from the Pathé lot in Culver City, and the same that was seen in the 1927 version of The King of Kings. And he also seemed to determine, and I believe he's correct, George Turner, that the cliff where Neil, John Herron, and Dr. Bruner, as played by Joseph Cawthorn, camp, that's around Bronson Canyon, California. And lastly, that the stone steps that Neil climbs to reach Legendre's castle are near Malibu. So I believe we have to give full credit to George Turner for determining some of these locations in terms of the film's rather, we could argue, short production. Although I think it should be underscored again with regard to talking about horror films of the early 30s in isolation. A couple of weeks shoot was not uncommon even for some, certainly not all, but some studio films as well. So at any rate, we'll give credit to George Turner there. We'll give credit to Arthur Martinelli for this wonderful use of depth and composition that we just saw. But we'll give credit to George Turner because all too often, I think, in terms of the history of horror film history and historians, plagiarism and repetition without proper accreditation occurs all too regularly. And so we will thank George Turner for a lot of the field work he did for what I've just been able to say. Now, so we've got that film being shot, 11 days, March, April 1932. Then what happens? What happens is that an organization gets involved, an organization called the American Securities Corporation, often referred to in the industry press of the time as the ASC. They were not actually a producer of the film. They didn't get involved until the film had already been shot, but they got involved around May or so, and I say or so because we don't know the exact date. One of the problems with to reuse an earlier term, orphan films, independently made films, is that there aren't always expansive studio files available to go through. Not that we can always go through the studio's own files either, but it looks like the ASC got involved around May of 1932 after the shoot was completed, and their role, their purpose for this film and in general was to advance capital on completed negatives. So they provided money in the end stages of independent films, which it takes, I think, with ease we can understand why they would do that, because that would be a rather safe time to get involved financially in an independent film. The general manager of ASC at that time was Sherman Krellberg, who had a lengthy history with this film long thereafter in terms of its reissues, and seems to have played a key role in the film's original distribution in 1932 because it was an independent film. And how do we then, as now, how do we get an independent film onto theater screens? And Krellberg and the ASC were important in that regard. In fact, they were important in that regard because Universal attached the White Zombie negative for some 8,607 in notes owed to them by the Halperins for the use of their studio rental space, and Phil Goldstone and the ASC finally settled that in July of 1932. This money owed for $11,000. So the Halperins, in other words, were in need of the ASC. They were in need of Krellberg and this last-minute money, even after shooting the film. Now, originally the Halperins had looked to Columbia and Educational Pictures for financial assistance for distribution, but after the ASC became involved, Krellberg began to look at other possibilities, states' rights distribution, whereby a film would be sold to different territories, territory by territory. But in the end, all of these parties that became increasingly involved in this wonderful, I think, horror film, all of these parties finally agreed on July 12, 1932, to a deal with United Artists to distribute White Zombie. So when sometimes people write about White Zombie being a United Artists film, this is why. It's unfair to call it a United Artists picture because it was entirely, at least 99.9% finished, we could argue, before UA even became involved. They were there for the distribution, not for the production of the film. Now, the Halperins had actually already previewed the film in mid-June, prior to United Artists coming aboard as distributor. And at that time, the film was 74 minutes in length. Further cuts, which to be fair, could have been made in part as a result of that preview, in part as the result of any number of persons we simply don't know. Krellberg, others suggesting small snips here and there, perhaps even persons at United Artists. But the further cutting brought the film down to 69 minutes when it went into original, when it was shown at its premiere and it went into its original distribution. Now, I'm going to stop for a moment because this scene we've just seen, I hesitate to say something I feel I must say because it's disappointed me ever since I first noted it many years ago. We've just lost our friend, the butler, Silver, I think in this wonderful scene where he's been carted off and thrown to his death. Unfortunately, the actor holds his nose at the moment he hits the water to, I suppose, not do an intake of that water, but it kind of spoils, I think, the otherwise very ominous, horrifying scene. But at any rate, so we have about a 69-minute film that premieres at the end of July in 1932, not too long after United Artists got involved. Now, this is, I think, a fascinating period for the horror film because, we've had such a small number of horror films in the sound period in Hollywood prior to White Zombie. So many persons at the time did look towards Dracula as being the first of those rather than a few prior possibilities we might name, like The Cat Creeps of 1930 or, say, even The Terror of 1928. But regardless, this is relatively early, and it's, I think, an important moment in the evolution of the American horror film, the American sound horror film, for many reasons. But one of them is that there was a great deal of concern in the industry at that moment about both horror films and gangster films. We could say Public Enemy and Little Caesar of 1931, the same year, for example, as Dracula and Frankenstein. The parent-teacher organizations that complained about these films, the fears that they might harm children who watched them, the fear that they would have backlashes in local communities. There was a lot of people in Hollywood by 1932, once it became obvious with the various films I've mentioned, including Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, that the worry was, okay, these films are making money. It is becoming, to use the language of the time, a cycle. A lot of people were saying, oh goodness, we really should not let this happen, along with the gangster pictures, because they're going to cause us more trouble than they will help us. And so we should try to really slow up on making these films. But White Zombies, huge success that summer, I think, comes at a real critical moment where others will say in the film industry, the money we're making off of these films outweighs any dangers, backlashes they may receive in whatever communities. For the film, however, United Artists, knowing the very kind of problems I'm talking about, they developed some interesting and quite different ads for the films. And to go beyond that, I would say individual exhibitors across the country who quite regularly created their own ads rather than using studio materials. Ads, for example, for newspaper publication, they varied a great deal. Some ads used the word horror, for example, to describe what kind of film is this. Other ads, however, used the term thriller, and as if to back away from that word horror in the ads. Or another term was thrill drama, that you and I are currently watching a thrill drama. Even the term romance picture was used in some ads to describe, hey, what am I walking in to see? In an audience poll of March 1932, thrill films, as they were called, led in an audience poll. So that's another reason I think that these different terms, these different genre terms were used and bandied about in different ads for the film. All that said, it's surprising some of the ads, I recall some from Los Angeles, for example, that were quite sexually explicit. Showing, for example, these eyes of Lugosi's, these penetrating eyes that we see in the film. Artwork of those eyes appeared in some ads that showed penetrating beams of light down towards artwork that was meant to be Madge Bellamy. I don't think it particularly looked like her. But the beams of light from each of his two eyes, one was hitting her breasts, another her genitalia, in very, I think, sexualized artwork. So the ads varied a good deal if we look at not merely the publicity materials prepared by United Artists, but across the country, what individual exhibitors chose to create on their own. Now, in terms of the next topic, I think that's logical to discuss is how did the film do, or how was it received, the response? And you'll look in some thumbnail sketches of horror film history that will say, well, the critics hated this movie. Now, like so much of what's said about the classic horror films, much incorrect data, or at a minimum we could say oversimplified data, becomes repeated. And because of the problem I mentioned earlier, where so many writers on horror film history simply recycle from other writers, often without accreditation, incorrect data begets more incorrect data. Now, let me clarify what I'm saying, though, in terms of White Zombie. When it premiered on July 28th, 1932 in New York at the Rivoli, the New York critics largely hated the film. That is true. The New York critics largely hated the film. The key exception is the New York Daily Mirror. When the film almost very quickly makes its way to Washington, D.C., critics there seem to hate the film as well. In fact, in an interesting moment, something that I find quite interesting, some of the advertisements begin to use the fact that critics in New York largely disliked the film and panned it as a way to promote audiences going to see it. In other words, your snooty newspaper critic didn't like it, but audiences love it. And the box office take at the Rivoli certainly proves that to be the case. The Rivoli, the premiere, the photographs of the exterior of the theater are wonderful, with the huge ballyhoo efforts that were used. At periodic moments during the day and night, 9 actors appeared on a stage built above the exterior theater marquee, going through scenes from the film, enacting them live to help draw in audience members. Magic illusions were done on the side of the theater all day, here at the Rivoli I'm talking about, and it did bring huge crowds. And we know from some contemporaneous accounts there were some people, perhaps a lot of them, actually scared by this film. And this film, it grossed $25,500 in its first week at the Rivoli. Now, theater box office grosses are an area that we don't have really time to get into, but they can be awfully confusing and complicated because they depend on so many factors: how many seats the theater owns, how much its ticket prices were. The fact that we hear and to give a number that might sound high or low doesn't necessarily speak to how much profit, real profit, the theater made. But in this case, we do know that the Rivoli reported that $25,500 was for them a, quote, huge gross. It made $15,000 its second week at the Rivoli. and it dropped off to what they considered a fairly sickly, to use their word, $8,000 gross in its third week. But it's doing well, and what we begin to see happening to maybe make more clear some of the things I've been saying, including about the film's reception, is that it does strong business. We can prove this with theater exhibitors' reports from the period. It does strong business in many cities across the country. It draws big audiences. The major exception, and I've never been able to determine quite why, it doesn't fully make sense to me. The major exception was Los Angeles, where it was a flop. But in most cities across America, and including in some smaller towns where we know the theater gross reports, it does really, really well. And to put to maybe underscore my point about the critics, to make more clear what I was saying, that's not an entirely true story, even though all of the New York critics, save one, panned the movie, and the same happened in D.C. The opposite was true in many other cities, you see. This is where we have to look at things, I think, more holistically. Good reviews appear in Seattle, they appear in Chicago, they appear in New Orleans, they appear in many other cities. There are good reviews that appear in industry trade publications like Variety and Film Daily and Hollywood Spectator. So the simplistic idea that critics hated the movie, well, that's just too simplistic a view. It was much more complicated than that. And in terms of the strong box office response, in terms of the money this film generated, our friends the Halperins, these friends who, these gentlemen, this producer and director team who had been in the business for a decade by 1932, they all of a sudden, with the huge success of this film, again, I believe it's possible to argue that we can't quantify this, but it's possible to argue that this may well have been the most successful independent film of the 1930s. And it's truly in a genre where independent horror films have been so important. It's the first major independent horror film in Hollywood feature history. The Halperins, after the 10 years I've described, they get quite the contract from Paramount Pictures, where they bring along with them men whom they, I think, rightly believed were responsible for some of the success of White Zombie, those men being screenwriter Garnet Weston and cinematographer Arthur Martinelli. They all four go to Paramount, where they make a film called Supernatural, another horror film, obviously, that starred Carole Lombard. That was a 1933 picture that did not do all that well. As a result, the Halperins ended up going back to independent film production, and they made a picture in 1936 without Bela Lugosi, our star in White Zombie, called Revolt of the Zombies, that was somewhat publicized, at least at times, as a sequel to White Zombie. They used Dean Jagger rather than Lugosi, and it actually was not a sequel to this film we're watching now. Among other things, it was set in Angkor. American Securities, ASC, that we spoke of earlier, actually sued the Halperins over the use of the term zombie, claiming that they had, in fact, controlled the rights to it, and Revolt of the Zombies was essentially a flop. The Halperins continued to make other films in the 30s, and Victor himself continued in the entertainment business until the 1950s, including a move into television production. In 1957, he married his last wife, who was a very wonderful woman that I was very privileged to get to know, and the two of them moved to Arkansas, where they lived until Victor Halperin's death in 1983. In terms of White Zombie, it began reappearing at theaters as early as 1934. And again, in the late 30s, there was a horror film revival with the reissue of Dracula and Frankenstein in 1938. And White Zombie reappeared again then. It reappeared again in the 1940s and in the 1950s, including a notable reissue, notable meaning the sheer number of theaters in which it appeared, in 1952. It also appeared on television as early as 1951 and has continued to ever since. In fact, there's a scene in Tim Burton's film Ed Wood in which the Ed Wood and Bela Lugosi characters are seated together watching it on television in the storyline that itself was set in the 1950s. Its reappearances were such that Lugosi himself talked about having been asked to appear in a sequel made in the 1950s, or I should say that would have been made in the 1950s, called Return of the White Zombie, though that never in fact happened. Now, I think at this point, for the conclusion of this commentary, we've talked about some of the origins, the context, for the film. We've talked about the production and some of the persons involved in the film and where it was shot and all of that kind of thing. And as a film historian myself, those are often sometimes the most fascinating details. But at this time, I'd like to switch and think about some other aspects of this film, some other ways of looking at it, including its storyline. Because despite what I've said about these Haitian texts of the 19th century, there's more of Martinelli's wonderful cinematography with a flower-like image that is duplicated on Madge Bellamy's costume. You see, despite the brevity of the shoot schedule, I think it's hard to argue that there was not some very strong thought put into the making of this film. But to go back to my point, we've talked about some of these Haitian texts of the 19th century. We've talked about the influence, and it's a very important influence of William B. Seabrook and the Magic Island. But nevertheless, Seabrook's book does not have an actual story plot line that could be fully lifted to become White Zombie. Nor are any of the other prior texts I've mentioned during the commentary. So we have to think a little further about the storyline, I think, and where did some of this come from? I think it's certainly been said by a number of people, and I believe appropriately, that the film bears some fairy tale-like qualities. I mean, we have a figure our figure there on screen at the moment, Murder Legendre, almost a figure of death. A very satanic kind of figure. In fact, I would argue that some of the storyline seems to be taken from Goethe's Faust, this arrangement between murder and Beaumont, this contract that they make, this devilish contract between them. And I'd go further and say that with regard to Jack Pierce's makeup for Lugosi, that he appears so much like many of the drawings and even photographs of, say, stage versions of Faust that had been staged prior to White Zombie. Say, speaking about the Widow's Peak and the goatee, we can find Calliope and so many persons who playing Mephistopheles. That Lugosi, I think, appears similar. So I think it's fair to say that Garnet Weston may have borrowed a little bit from Goethe. I think it's been said many times that there is, perhaps we could argue, a fairy tale-like quality to the film. It's a rather simplistic story, but we could also say that of so many other 1930s films. John Carradine once made the wonderful remark that when he started making movies, they were black and white in more than one respect, meaning that the good guys were too good to be true, the white, and the bad guys were so awful that they were just demons, practically, the black. And so I think that's happening here. I think one could draw an allusion to the mythic qualities that Weston may have known about. Orpheus and Eurydice comes to mind. I certainly can't say that anybody involved in the filmmaking of the film saw Fritz Lang's 1921 film Destiny, but I think the film White Zombie in some ways echoes it. Now, I don't have time to go into what could be the many other possible influences upon the film, but I think to conclude this section of the commentary, I would say that we have to consider that du Maurier's Trilby, the famous novel of the late 19th century, and the fact that it had become made into the famous film Svengali the year before with John Barrymore, the kind of hypnotic control of Legendre over, say, our friend here on screen, our wonderful actress Madge Bellamy. I think that has to be said in thinking about the storyline. Now, to conclude, I have to go back to what I promised you. The promise I made that I would talk about and hopefully, even if I do not convince you, discuss and make us think about the fact that White Zombie is not nearly as outdated as so many people have always argued, certainly not by 1932 standards. And I mean, maybe we think that for several reasons. Scratchy prints could be one reason that have circulated. Again, I applaud the Rhone Group so much for the restoration work they've done time after time with this film. But let's think about why I say what I'm saying. In terms of imagery, we can say that this is the first sound horror film in American America to use superimpositions. And we get them with Madeline, Madge Bellamy's character, in the pub while Neil is drinking. We get them with Legendre's eyes, including at the beginning as they seem to hover over the Haitian environment. We get them in a lot of fascinating, it was just happening right before I spoke, a lot of fascinating moving camera. There's a good deal of moving camera, well-executed moving camera in this film. The optical printing in this film is well worth noting in terms of its visuals. Only Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde had previously used optically printing for split screen, and we see split screen in here. We also get wonderful transition wipes, optically printed wipes that move from one scene to another. These would be things that you don't see in prior horror films. In terms of imagery, as we come close to the end of the film, we see with Legendre's death an on-screen death. In this case of the villain. Something that, if you go back to Dracula, Frankenstein, Murder by the Clock, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the other sound horror films, something that you don't generally see. Murders in the Rue Morgue, another example, you don't generally see. So these are reasons in terms of imagery that I would say that this film is certainly modern in many respects by 1932 standards. This would also extend to the film's editing, and not merely the kind of optical transitions I've mentioned, but in terms of its editing speed, its pacing. Dracula has an average shot length of 9.4 seconds. Murder by the Clock has an average shot length of 11.5. Svengali has an average shot length of 7.1. Frankenstein, 8.5 seconds. Jekyll and Hyde, 13.2. The Monster Walks, 16.76. Freaks, 10.4. Murders in the Rue Morgue, 8.49 seconds. This is how often, in other words, an ASL, an average shot length, how often is the audience seeing one picture cut to another on average. White Zombie's average shot length is 8.07 seconds, which actually makes it, despite anybody who wants to say the film's slow, and that's a personal opinion that we might have for many reasons of just boredom, we don't like the film, whatever. But in terms of objective reality, White Zombie moves faster than any previous American sound horror film, save for Svengali. And I think that's important to underscore as part of this larger argument I'm making. Also critical to the argument I'm making is sound, and not merely some of the incredible sound effects we've heard, like the grinding of the sugar mill, but also the music. One way we judge the modernity of a film from this period often is by how much music it has, whether it's background music or whether it's music embedded in a scene, like a character, our friend Madge Bellamy playing the piano. And of all that list of films I talked about in terms of editing, the reality is White Zombie has much more music than any of those films, a wide array of music, thoughtfully chosen, often even underscoring and commenting upon our villainous Legendre character. Now, this is where I would be saying, and I hope even if you don't agree, you will consider my argument that, yes, the film's old, but it's not outdated by 1932 standards. In some respects, it's even ahead of the other horror films that predated it. In conclusion, I would just like to thank you for listening to this commentary for one of my all-time favorite films, and I hope you have enjoyed this time watching it as much as I have.